What's up guys, this is Heis, and today we're doing another video taking a look at how the wheels interact with the track. This time our subject is Rio Grande Southern number 20, a 460 10-wheeler known as a T19 class that worked for the Florence and Cripple Creek and Rio Grande Southern Railroads. It's now in operation at the Colorado Railroad Museum. This locomotive is going to be an interesting comparison compared to the 491, our previous subject, because the 20 is considerably smaller than the 491, and it features three key differences between it and the 491. The first is that it has a four-wheel swing-link lead truck. The second is that there is no trailing truck whatsoever. And the third is that the number 2 driver is blind. A blind driver is a driver with no flange, like this top wheel set that's drawn here. You can see that a more typical wheel set is down below right here, where the wheels have a tapered profile that curves up to a defined flange on the inside of the wheel, so that when they're riding the rail, the flange can stop the motion of the wheel once it comes up to the rail itself. This top wheel set has blind drivers, and they're drawn a little bit exaggerated to make the point. There's actually 2 tapers on a blind driver set, one in the direction you'd expect on the typical wheel set, and one that's reverse that on the inside. The middle is machined flat. And as well, the wheels within a blind driver set are usually wider than the wheels of a standard set. As well, the distance between wheels on a blind set is usually smaller than the distance between wheels on a standard set. The reasoning behind this is that a blind wheel set helps a locomotive negotiate a tight turn, whether it's a very large, long, rigid locomotive, or it's a small locomotive like Rio Grande Southern number 20 trying to duke it out in the mountains of Colorado on the 3-foot narrow gauge. The extra width and lack of flange allows the rail to wander quite far around this wheel set while still providing traction. So I'm really interested to see what the 20 does. Like last time, we're going to start at the front of the locomotive and work our way back down each wheel set. And we're going to monitor each wheel set through a straight piece of track, then entering a curve, and then exiting a curve to see how everything works. And I gotta say, mounting the cameras to 20 proved to be a challenge.
Am I about to clamp to a brake shoe? Good God. Or brake head? Yeah. That's about all I got.
Here's the first wheel set on the pony truck. Riding through the straight, you can see the slight gap between the flange and the rail. As it dances through the frogs, it moves a bit, but running mostly in the center of the tread. Next is the second lead truck wheel, second axle. Remember, it's a 4-wheel lead truck, and it's also riding with pretty much the same gap, so it's tracking relatively straight, though you can see the dance it does compared to the cylinder up to the right. Here's the first driver. This is our first powered wheel set, and it's also pretty much smack in the center of the taper, pretty much what we'd expect. And here's that number 2 blind driver. You can see that it's riding pretty much in the center on the flat part of the driver itself. Also neat in this shot is in the upper left, you can see the Stephenson valve gear eccentrics doing their thing. And that's a nifty shot that you don't get to see all that often. And here's the number 3. This is the last wheel on the locomotive. And it's also pretty much doing what the number 1's doing, which means that overall, down straight track, everything's pretty much holding up to the theory, which is really cool to see. And now let's get into the curves. Back up again at that first wheel. We're on the straight. And as we enter the curve, you can see the flange gap increase through that switch, though it does have to dart around that guardrail. But now that we're in the curve, you can see that the opposite flange is going to be a lot closer, probably riding up against the rail, as this inside rail has quite the gap between the flange and the actual railhead itself. One thing that's interesting to note about this shot is that the camera is actually mounted to the body of the truck. So you can see the wheel move with all of its lateral, but you can also see the locomotive move independent of the truck if you look at the pilot beam up ahead. Now here is the second wheel in the lead truck, entering the curve, get through the guardrail and the switches and everything. And we can see that it appears to be doing a similar thing to what the lead axle is doing. With a 4-wheel lead truck, independent of the actual body of the locomotive itself, it's pivoting about roughly the center of the truck. So the fact that the lead wheel and the second wheel on this truck are doing about the same thing means that both of those flanges on the outside are going to be scraping up against the outside rail, and it's going to be help guiding that central pivot location of the truck and locomotive itself. Here's the number 1 driver, and we're entering that switch and entering the curve now. And you can see that the number 1 driver doesn't seem to move over that far. It's probably riding somewhere in the middle if I had to guess. I almost want to go back and film the other wheel now. But it really looks like it's not riding anywhere near the far outside of the tread surface. It actually looks like it's riding roughly in the middle, maybe a little bit further to the left than it normally is. So the lead truck's really doing its job, though that is through a shallower curve, and now we're getting into a little bit of a sharper curve through the cut here. And now we're starting to ride on that outside of the taper there. So interesting. There's definitely something to be said for the actual radius of the curve that you're going around. Remember that our sharpest curves at the museum are actually 28-degree curves, which is a pretty sharp curve in railroading. Now here's the blind number 2. Going through the switch and getting onto the curve. And it's still riding at about the center, but remember this is that broad curve that the first driver didn't really do much around. But you can see that the wheel is starting to shift towards the inside rail. The blind wheel set is doing what it's intended for, where it's allowing the rail to wander further inwards than it may not necessarily be able to if there was a flange and further tapered profile there. You can see as the curvature changes throughout some points in the cut, it actually goes even further in, and now that we're back onto a shallower curve, it's almost back to dead center again. And here's the number 3 driver. Let's see if it follows 491's pattern. And we're in the curve. And that flange is rubbing up against the rail, isn't it? Interesting. So even despite the turn being a little bit more shallow in this direction, we're going clockwise instead of counterclockwise like we were in 491's video. Even then, the rear flange on the rearmost axle is still scraping on the inside as we're applying power. So it seems like the locomotive's still hitting the turns pretty much the same way, although with a couple minor differences with the way the 4-wheel lead truck is, and as well with that blind driver. Now let's try transitioning out of the curve into a straight piece of track. Now we're taking a look at the first pilot wheel, and it's riding pretty far on the inside there. There's a big gap between the flange and the rail. And at the grade crossing is when the track starts to straighten out of this 28-degree curve. And it straightens up, and then the wheel takes a little bit to move back over, but it's centered at the other side of the crossing. Now let's take a look at the second wheel on the pilot truck. Also seems to be dancing around about the same distance, maybe a little bit less than the lead wheel. And as we're coming into the crossing, the wheel actually centers up sooner than the lead wheel did. And that's because, remember, we're pivoting around the center of the truck. So that makes sense. And here's our number 1 driver. And this is going to be the sharpest curve on the railroad, so it should have the biggest gap through some of this curve. And it does seem like it is. The rail's right around the cleanest part of the exterior of the tire there. And pretty much when we get into the crossing, midway through the panel, it's back to straight. And now here's the blind number 2 driver. Let's see what this thing does. It's looking like the wheel is riding on the inside of the rail a little bit. The rail's shifted to the left relative to the wheel most of the way through this. Remember, this is the sharp curve on the railroad. And as we get to the crossing, the rail actually moves back to the right before ultimately centering back up and riding in the middle of the profile. Interesting. Here's the number 3 driver. Flange scraping up against the inside rail here, and it continues to ride along the flange even as we get close to the crossing. And right about here, the rest of the engine's starting to center up, and it starts to pull that rear wheel away. So my guess on that blind number 2 driver is that as the rear wheel is still holding to the flange and everything else is working on centering up, the lead truck centers up before the number 1 driver does, which is why the blind rode over to the other side for a brief second. That's pretty cool. So overall, it does seem that 20 does behave very similarly to 491, where the leading wheels scrape up against the outside rail and the trailing wheels scrape up against the inside. We did get to note the fun difference with having a 4-wheel lead truck versus a 2-wheel lead truck, and how that affected the number 1 driver and pulling the locomotive over a little bit more, as well as seeing how the number 2 blind driver interacted with the rail, which was really cool to see. However, one of the things that I've been talking about with the world famous Jeff Taylor, Colorado Railroad Museum curator of rolling stock and equipment, about is specifically talking about how this may change light engine versus engine pulling a load, and also through different degrees of curvature. Most of what we looked at in 491's video was really sharp curves, and most of what we looked at in this video was a mixture of broad and sharp curves, but even the broad curves at our narrow gauge railroad are actually pretty tight in comparison. So what does this look like on a broad sweeping turn on a standard gauge railroad? I don't know, but I'd love to come find out. You work for a tourist railroad and you want me to come out and come film your locomotives, please let me know. But before we go, there is one thing that I did note that probably will end up influencing the light engine debate, which I noticed while sifting through my footage that was really cool. Let's take a look at this. So this is looking at the lead truck of the RGS-20 as we're going up through the cut. And she slips partway through the cut. And when she slips, you can watch the truck center up, like it's no longer being shoved into the outside of the rail. So perhaps an engine running by itself, not working as hard, without a train, etc., may not run all the way to the outside as we've seen so far. More studying to be done, and I'm excited to guide us through it. Let me know what you'd like to see in the comments. And as always, thanks so much for watching.